The morning sun cast long shadows across Jack Harmon's ranch as he walked the perimeter fence line, his weathered boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. At 52, his 6-foot frame remained as solid as the oak posts that marked the boundaries of the land his grandfather had purchased in 1947. The ranch sat 17 miles from the nearest town in South Texas, with the Mexican border just 4 miles to the south, close enough that Jack could sometimes hear vehicles on the other side during particularly quiet nights. 20 years in the Marine Corps had left their mark on Jack, a slight limp from shrapnel caught in Fallujah, a collection of scars across his torso, and eyes that never quite relaxed, even here on his own property. 3 tours in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan had turned situational awareness into something as natural as breathing. Even now, as he inspected a section of cut fence, his gaze methodically swept the horizon every 30 seconds, an unconscious habit born from years of knowing that failure to observe could mean death. "Third cut this month," he muttered to himself, kneeling to examine the clean slice through the barbed wire. This wasn't the work of desperate migrants looking for passage. Those cuts were usually hasty, jagged. These were precision cuts, the kind made with quality wire cutters by someone who had time and wasn't worried about being spotted. Jack removed the repair kit from his pack and began methodically fixing the breach, his hands working with practiced efficiency. The Harmon Ranch sprawled across 1,200 acres of unforgiving terrain, mesquite thickets, dry creek beds, and rolling scrubland that bloomed briefly with wildflowers after the infrequent rains. To most, it might seem like hardscrabble nothing, but to Jack, every acre told a story. The old cattle pond where his father had taught him to swim. The lightning-struck oak where his grandfather had buried the family dog. The high ridge where, on clear days, you could see 20 miles in every direction. Jack had never planned to return here permanently. The Marines had been his life, his identity. Staff Sergeant Harmon, specialist in defensive operations and force protection. The man who could secure a forward operating base in hostile territory with limited resources and keep his people alive. His superiors had called him the human early warning system for his uncanny ability to sense trouble before it materialized. That situational awareness had saved countless lives during his deployments. As he finished repairing the fence, Jack's hand unconsciously drifted to the scar on his left shoulder, a parting gift from a Taliban sniper in Helmand province. The bullet had missed his heart by 2 inches. His spotter, Lance Corporal Rodriguez, hadn't been so lucky that day. Jack still wrote to Rodriguez's parents twice a year, still carried the weight of surviving when others hadn't. The distant rumble of an engine drew Jack's attention to the dirt road that snaked toward his property. He recognized the white Border Patrol truck from half a mile away and the familiar figure of Agent Carlos Mendez behind the wheel. Jack and Carlos had developed a rapport over the past 5 years. Mutual respect between men who understood what it meant to stand on the line between order and chaos. "Morning, Harmon," Carlos called as he stepped from the vehicle, adjusting his green uniform hat against the strengthening sun. At 35, Carlos had the weary eyes of someone who'd seen too much but hadn't yet surrendered to cynicism. "Found more fence cuts?" Jack nodded, gesturing toward the freshly repaired section. "Professional job. Same as the others." Carlos surveyed the landscape with practiced eyes. "Cartel's getting bolder. 2 more ranches hit last night about 15 miles east. Cameras caught 6 men moving product across the Peters place." The news settled like a stone in Jack's stomach. The Peters ranch was similar to his. Remote, sparse population, good sight lines for anyone watching for law enforcement. Perfect territory for smuggling operations. "Anyone hurt?" "No," Carlos replied. "But they left a message. Spray painted on the barn. This land has new owners now." Jack's jaw tightened. He'd seen this pattern before, though in different terrain and with different players. In Afghanistan, insurgents would probe an area before establishing a presence, testing defenses, establishing routes, intimidating locals. The tactics were different, but the strategy was familiar. "They're mapping the weak points," Jack said quietly, "looking for paths of least resistance." Carlos nodded, unsurprised by Jack's assessment. He'd learned to value the former Marine's insights. "We're stretched thin, Jack. Budget cuts, politics, you know how it goes. Can't put a patrol on every ranch." Jack understood the subtext. The border was vast, the personnel limited, and the cartels well-funded and determined. Law enforcement could respond, but they couldn't be everywhere at once. Men like Jack were increasingly on their own. "Keep your eyes open," Carlos advised, though they both knew Jack didn't need the reminder. "And maybe think about that security system we talked about." After Carlos departed, Jack returned to the ranch house, a sturdy single-story structure of stone and timber that had stood against Texas storms for 70 years. Inside was a study in functionality. Simple furniture, minimal decoration, everything with a purpose. The living room wall held the only personal shrine Jack allowed himself. Photos of his Marine units, his parents at the ranch's front gate in younger days, and his grandfather in his World War II uniform. Jack moved to his office, unlocking the bottom drawer of his desk to reveal a worn leather-bound journal. Inside were meticulous notes, dates, times, and locations of every suspicious activity he'd observed over the past 6 months. 3 fence cuts in the north section. Unfamiliar tire tracks by the Dry Creek bed. Unknown vehicles observed on county roads with no apparent destination. Drone flights at night, distinguished from Border Patrol operations by their flight patterns. Individually, each might mean nothing. Together, they formed a pattern that Jack's training wouldn't let him ignore. The radio on his desk crackled to life, a private channel shared by several local ranchers who looked out for each other in this remote stretch of land. "Jack, you there? It's Henry." The voice belonged to Henry Weston, whose smaller ranch bordered Jack's to the east. "Go ahead, Henry. Had 2 men on ATVs cross my South 40 about an hour ago. Said they were surveyors when I confronted them, but they took off when I asked who they worked for. Headed your way, I think. Thanks for the heads up. I'll keep an eye out." Jack moved to the gun safe concealed behind a false panel in the closet. Inside was a carefully maintained collection, his service M9 Beretta, a Remington 700 sniper rifle similar to what he'd used as a Marine Scout sniper, several hunting rifles, and a Mossberg shotgun. He chose the Beretta, checking it with practiced hands before holstering it under his light jacket. Not out of fear, but preparedness, another habit the Corps had instilled in him. On the kitchen table lay the property blueprints and survey maps, another project Jack had been working on since the fence cuts began. He was mapping his own land from a defensive perspective, identifying choke points, observation posts, and potential security vulnerabilities. It was second nature to him, analyzing terrain for tactical advantage, just as he'd done for military compounds in Anbar province in Kandahar. The afternoon brought no sign of the ATV riders Henry had mentioned, but Jack used the time to check the primitive early warning systems he'd established around the property, trip wires connected to battery-powered alarms in remote areas, game cameras positioned at strategic points, and modified pressure plates near commonly used trails. Low-tech but effective measures that wouldn't be easily detected or disabled. As evening approached, Jack drove his truck to the highest point on his property, a rocky outcropping that offered commanding views in all directions. Locals called it Sentinel Hill, and Jack found the name fitting. He'd come here often since returning to the ranch, sometimes with purpose, sometimes just to think. Today, he brought his high-powered binoculars and a thermos of coffee, settling in for an observation session as the sun began its descent. The changing light painted the landscape in golds and deep shadows, revealing details that disappeared in the harsh midday sun. Jack methodically scanned the terrain, section by section, with the patience of a man who had once spent 72 hours in a high position tracking insurgent movements. Nothing rushed, nothing overlooked. Through the binoculars, he spotted a dust cloud on a distant road, a vehicle moving too fast for these rough paths. He tracked it until it disappeared behind a ridge, making a mental note of the location. Another puzzle piece. As darkness fell, Jack's phone vibrated with a text message from Maria Suarez, whose family ranch lay to the west of his property. The Suarez family had been in the area even longer than the Harmons, and Maria had taken over operations after her father's death 3 years ago. At 38, she managed the ranch with quiet competence that had earned Jack's respect. Strange men asking questions at the gas station in town, her message read. Wanted to know which ranches had owner-occupiers versus hired hands. Mentioned your place specifically. Jack's jaw tightened as he typed his response. Thanks for the warning. Stay alert. The night wind carried the distant howl of coyotes as Jack made his way back to the ranch house. The sound reminded him of Afghanistan, the wild dogs that would prowl the perimeter of forward operating bases after dark. Different predators, same behaviors. Testing boundaries, looking for weakness. Inside, Jack reviewed his journal entries by lamplight, connections forming in his mind. This wasn't random criminal activity. It was systematic reconnaissance, the kind that precedes an operation. The cartel wasn't just passing through. They were planning to establish a presence. His land wasn't just convenient passage, it was a target. Jack had seen what happened to areas where cartels established operational control. He'd studied the tactics during his last years in the Corps when the Marine intelligence units had begun sharing information with border security forces. Intimidation, corruption, violence, a cancer that spread through communities until normal life became impossible. Not here, he said to the empty room, his voice quiet but resolved. Not on my watch. Later that night, Jack stood on his front porch, listening to the sounds of the Texas wilderness. To untrained ears, it might seem peaceful. But Jack heard what others missed, the sudden silence of insects when something disturbed them, the change in bird calls when territorial boundaries were crossed. The land itself was an early warning system for those who knew how to listen. His thoughts drifted to his father's final days, 5 years earlier. The cancer had taken everything but the old man's determination. This land isn't just dirt and rock, Jack, he'd said, his voice barely a whisper. It's a trust. From those who came before to those who will come after. Your grandfather understood that. I hope you do too. At the time, Jack had nodded, not fully comprehending. He'd been a Marine then, his identity wrapped in uniform and duty far from this place. But standing here now, he finally understood what his father had meant. This wasn't just about property rights or fences. This was about standing ground against forces that would take by intimidation what they couldn't claim legitimately. Jack had defended far-flung outposts in foreign lands for most of his adult life. Now, the battle line had come to him. The irony wasn't lost on him. Surviving firefights in Ramadi and ambushes in the Hindu Kush, only to face a new threat on the land where he'd learned to walk. The distant drone of an aircraft caught his attention, too small for commercial traffic, too low for military operations. Jack tracked it by sound alone, his trained ear noting its path directly over the ranch before it continued south toward the border. Another piece of the puzzle. Inside, he made a final note in his journal before turning in for the night. They're watching. Which means they're coming. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, let them come. I've been watched by better. Jack Harmon slept lightly that night, as he had every night since Fallujah in 2004. Outside, the Texas night continued its ancient rhythms, unaware that it had become contested ground in a conflict as old as civilization itself, the struggle between those who build and those who take. And in that contest, Jack Harmon was no longer just a rancher trying to live in peace. He was once again a sentry at the gates. G. S. H. A. D. O. W. S. A. C. R. O. S. S. J. A. C. K. H. A. R. M. O. N. Jack woke before dawn, an old habit the Corps had burned into him that civilian life had never erased. The ranch house was silent save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the structure settling. He moved through his morning routine with military precision, 15 minutes from bed to fully dressed, coffee brewing as he checked the security feeds from the cameras he'd installed at key points around the property. The pre-dawn footage showed nothing unusual, but Jack's instincts. honed through 5 combat deployments, told him something had changed. He couldn't identify what had triggered his awareness, but he'd learned long ago not to ignore these feelings. They had kept him alive in places where others had died. After a spare breakfast, Jack grabbed his rifle and binoculars and headed out to the eastern ridge that overlooked the most likely approach routes to his property. The first hints of sunrise were just breaking over the horizon as he settled into a natural depression that offered both concealment and a commanding view. Standard observation post selection, the kind of positioning he'd taught young Marines in Afghanistan. 2 hours of methodical surveillance revealed nothing obvious until Jack noticed something that didn't belong, a flash of reflected light from the mesquite thicket near his eastern fence line, about 800 yards from his position. Too deliberate to be natural, too brief to be accidental. Someone was watching his property, using optics of some kind. Jack remained motionless, controlling his breathing as he focused his binoculars on the area. Patience was a sniper's greatest ally, and Jack had learned to outwaste his targets years ago. 20 minutes later, his patience was rewarded when a figure briefly emerged from the thicket to adjust position. Male, wearing earth-toned clothing that almost matched the surrounding vegetation. Almost, but not quite. The observer was good, but not military good. Rather than confront the watcher directly, Jack carefully extracted himself from his position and circled around to approach from behind, using the terrain for concealment exactly as he had when stalking Taliban observers in the mountains of Afghanistan. It took him 40 minutes of careful movement to close within 50 yards of the hidden figure without detection. The man was alone, using a high-end spotting scope on a small tripod to observe Jack's ranch house and outbuildings. Beside him lay a notebook with what appeared to be hand-drawn maps and time notations. Professional reconnaissance, not casual observation. Jack closed the final distance silently, years of field craft making his approach virtually undetectable. He was 10 feet away when he finally spoke, his voice deliberately calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "That's private property you're surveilling. And I don't recall giving permission." The man startled violently, nearly knocking over his spotting scope as he reached toward his waistband. Jack's rifle was already trained center mass. "I wouldn't," Jack said evenly. "Hands where I can see them." The man froze, then slowly raised his hands. He was younger than Jack had expected, maybe early 30s, with the lean build of someone who spent considerable time in the field. His eyes held the calculating look of a professional assessing options. "Just taking pictures, senor," the man said, his English good but accented. "For Nature magazine. The birds here, they are very special." With a tactical spotting scope, a sidearm, and no camera, Jack replied, nodding toward the pistol visible beneath the man's light jacket. "Try again." A flicker of reassessment crossed the man's features as he realized he wasn't dealing with a typical rancher. "You have a nice property," he said, changing tactics. "My employer has interest in land in this area. Perhaps you would consider selling? The price would be very generous." "Not interested," Jack said flatly. "Who's your employer?" The man shrugged, a practiced gesture of innocence. "A development company. They send me to look at properties with potential." Most developers send real estate agents, not armed men with military-grade observation equipment, Jack countered. Last chance for honesty. Something changed in the man's eyes then, a coldness replacing the false friendliness. "You should reconsider your position, Mr. Harmon. My employers will have this land. The only question is whether you profit from the transaction or not." The use of his name confirmed what Jack had already suspected. This wasn't a random encounter. They had specifically targeted his property and had done their homework. "Your employers," Jack said, his voice hardening. "Whoever they are, should know that this land isn't for sale. Not now, not ever. I suggest you relay that message clearly." The man's mouth curved into a slight smile. "They said you would be difficult. The stubborn Marine who thinks he can stand alone." He shook his head slowly. "No one stands alone against Los Hierros, senor. Los Hierros, the Irons." Jack had heard the name during briefings with border security forces before his retirement. a relatively new cartel faction known for ruthless efficiency and military-style operations, reportedly led by former Mexican Special Forces officers who had gone rogue. Their appearance in this sector represented a significant escalation from the usual drug runners and human traffickers. "You have 5 minutes to get off my land," Jack said, his rifle unwavering. "After that, I call Border Patrol and report an armed trespasser." The man gathered his equipment unhurriedly, his movements deliberately casual. "We will meet again, Mr. Harmon," he said as he packed the spotting scope. "My name is Diego, by the way. It's only polite that you know the name of the man who will take your land." Jack maintained his position as Diego walked away, heading toward the fence line where a camouflaged ATV was hidden under a brush cover. Only after the sound of the engine had faded did Jack approach the observation post, carefully examining the area for anything left behind. In a deliberate move that could only be interpreted as a message, Diego had left a small metal object partially buried in the dirt, an iron nail bent into a circle. The symbol of Los Hierros, left as a calling card. Jack pocketed it, additional evidence of what he was now facing. Back at the ranch house, Jack called Carlos Mendez, providing a detailed description of Diego and the encounter. The Border Patrol agent's response confirmed Jack's concerns. "Los Hierros have been moving into the region over the past 6 months," Carlos explained. "They've taken over operations from 3 smaller outfits. Their leader, guy called El Arquitecto, is ex-Mexican Special Forces. Runs his operation like a military campaign. They're scouting my property," Jack said. "Professional reconnaissance, Carlos. Not the usual border crossing activity." There was a pause on the line. "I'll file the report, Jack, but honestly, we're swamped. Unless there's active trafficking or violence, this gets put in the information pile." Jack understood. Border Patrol was undermanned and overwhelmed, forced to prioritize immediate threats over potential ones. "I appreciate the honesty," he said. "Just wanted it on record." After ending the call, Jack pulled out the topographical maps of his property and the surrounding area. If Los Hierros were conducting reconnaissance, they were planning something significant. His years of defensive operations experience told him to start preparing now, before the situation escalated further. That evening, Jack drove into town for supplies, mentally cataloging what he would need if the situation deteriorated. The hardware store yielded motion sensors, additional game cameras, and materials for improvised alarm systems. The grocery store provided enough non-perishable food for 2 weeks. Old habits from forward operating base management kicking in. Always maintain supplies for longer than you think you'll need them. As he loaded his purchases into his truck, Jack noticed a black SUV with tinted windows parked across the street, 2 figures visible in the front seats. Not bothering to hide their surveillance, a subtle form of intimidation. Jack memorized the license plate without openly staring at the vehicle, then drove out of town at exactly the speed limit. The SUV followed at a discreet distance until he turned onto the dirt road leading to his ranch. Later that night, Jack's phone rang. Maria Suarez calling from her neighboring ranch. "Jack, I think you should know," she said without preamble. "2 men came by today asking about you. Said they were from the county assessor's office, wanted to know about property boundaries between our ranches." "County assessor doesn't make house calls for boundary questions," Jack replied, immediately alert. "What did they look like?" Maria described the visitors, both Latino, one older with a military bearing, the other younger with a businesslike demeanor. They had been polite but insistent, asking specifically about access roads and water rights shared between the properties. "They were very interested in your daily routine," Maria added. "Asked when you're usually home, if you have regular visitors." "I didn't like it, so I kept my answers vague." "You did the right thing," Jack assured her. "These aren't government officials, Maria. They're cartel, Los Hierros specifically. They've been watching my place, probably yours too." Maria's intake of breath was audible over the line. As a lifelong resident of the borderlands, she understood the implications. "What do we do?" For now, stay vigilant. Don't confront them if they return, but document everything. I'm setting up additional security measures on my property. Might be good for you to do the same. My father's old hunting rifles are still here, Maria said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. And I've got Luis and Miguel working the ranch. We're not defenseless. After ending the call, Jack conducted a final perimeter check before returning to the house. The night was clear, stars brilliant in the vast Texas sky. In Afghanistan, he learned to tell time by the stars' positions, navigating by constellations during nighttime operations. Different terrain, same stars. The thought was oddly comforting. As he walked the property's edge, Jack's mind processed the day's developments with the analytical focus that had made him an effective defensive specialist. Los Hierros wasn't just passing through. They were establishing area dominance, identifying key terrain, assessing resistance, gathering intelligence. Classic military preparation for an operation. The cartel wanted his land for its strategic location, a perfect vantage point to monitor border patrol movements while offering multiple ingress and egress routes. Jack's isolated ranch house could serve as a command post, the outbuildings as storage for whatever they were moving across the border. The fact that they had attempted negotiation first suggested they preferred to avoid violence. But Diego's parting message made it clear force remained an option. The next morning brought no visible cartel presence, but Jack knew better than to assume they had retreated. He spent the day implementing the first phase of his defensive preparations, upgrading existing security measures and adding new ones. Additional cameras at strategic points, motion sensors tied to silent alerts on his phone, improvised early warning devices along likely approach routes. The kinds of passive security measures he'd established around forward operating bases in Iraq. Shortly after noon, Jack received a text from Henry Weston. Strange truck parked on County Road overlooking your north pasture. 2 men with binoculars. Want me to check it out? Jack replied immediately. No. Stay clear. Just note description and location. The information confirmed Jack's suspicion. Los Hierros was conducting comprehensive surveillance, establishing observation posts around the property's perimeter. They were mapping his movements, identifying patterns and vulnerabilities. It was the same approach Jack would have used to assess a target zone. That night, one of Jack's perimeter alarms triggered at 2:17 a.m., a tripwire connected to a silent alert system on his phone. Without turning on any lights, Jack moved to the pre-positioned observation point at his bedroom window, using night vision goggles to scan the indicated sector. 3 figures moved across his north field, their heat signatures clear against the cooler background. They carried long objects that the thermal imaging identified as rifles. Not border crossers or smugglers trying to pass unnoticed. This was an armed reconnaissance team conducting a close-in assessment of his defenses. Jack watched as they methodically examined his fence line, checking gates and testing the strength of the barriers. Their movements were coordinated and efficient, not random criminals but trained operators. They spent 20 minutes conducting their assessment before melting back into the darkness toward the northern boundary. Rather than confronting them directly, Jack documented their movements, adding the information to his growing intelligence file. Know your enemy before engaging. Another lesson from his Marine days. The cartel was showing impressive patience in their preparation, which made them more dangerous than impulsive criminals. The next day brought a more direct approach. Jack was repairing an irrigation pump when a black SUV, the same one from town, pulled up to his front gate. 2 men emerged, one older with silver-streaked hair and the straight posture of military training, the other younger in an expensive suit that looked out of place in the dusty border country. Jack approached the gate, deliberately leaving his rifle visible in his truck nearby, not threatening, but not unarmed either. Mr. Harmon, the older man called in accented but precise English. I hope we find you well today. My name is Colonel Vargas, retired from the Mexican Army. This is Mr. Ortiz, representing our business interests. Jack said nothing, waiting for them to continue. We represent a consortium of investors interested in properties in this region, Vargas continued smoothly. Your ranch has particularly desirable characteristics. We are prepared to offer 3 times its market value for an immediate sale." "Not interested," Jack replied flatly. "As I told your scout Diego yesterday." Vargas smiled thinly. "Diego can be undiplomatic. I prefer direct business discussions between professionals. You and I, Mr. Harmon, we understand each other. We both served our countries with distinction. Now we pursue other interests." "If you served with distinction," Jack replied, "you wouldn't be here representing Los Hierros." The mention of the cartel's name caused a flicker of reaction from the younger man, but Vargas maintained his composure. "Labels are unimportant in business. What matters is mutual benefit. You have something we want. We have something you want. What I want," Jack said evenly, "is for you and your organization to stay off my land." Vargas studied him for a long moment. "You know, in Afghanistan, the Americans built many forward operating bases in strategic locations. When they withdrew, those bases became valuable assets for local interests. This is no different. The tide is changing, Mr. Harmon. Smart men recognize when to make advantageous retreats." The reference to Afghanistan was deliberate. Vargas had done his homework on Jack's military background. It was meant to establish common ground, while simultaneously delivering a veiled threat. "My family has held this land for 3 generations, Jack responded. "We don't retreat." Vargas nodded as if he had expected this answer. "Family legacy is admirable. But consider this. Legacies can end tragically. I would prefer a business transaction to other, less pleasant alternatives." He reached into his jacket and produced a business card, extending it through the gate. "When you reconsider, call this number. The offer stands for 48 hours. Jack took the card without looking at it. "Don't come back to my property, Colonel. Next time, I call Border Patrol immediately." "Border Patrol," Vargas said with a small smile. "Overworked, understaffed, bound by rules and regulations. Tell me, Mr. Harmon, when you were securing perimeters in hostile territory, did you rely solely on distant authorities for protection?" Without waiting for an answer, Vargas and Ortiz returned to their vehicle and departed, leaving a cloud of dust on the dirt road. Jack examined the business card, blank except for a phone number and a small stylized logo of a bent nail forming a circle. The iron symbol again. Jack spent the remainder of the day conducting a complete surveillance sweep of his property, looking for any signs that Los Hierros had left monitoring devices or infiltrated his perimeter during the night. At the far eastern boundary, he found evidence of their presence, a game camera that wasn't his, carefully positioned to observe the approach to his ranch house. Rather than removing it, Jack adjusted its angle slightly to feed them a restricted view. Let them think their surveillance was intact while limiting what they could actually see. That evening, Jack drove to Maria's ranch, taking an indirect route and watching for tails. He found her checking irrigation lines in the south pasture, her hands dirty, but her grip firm as they shook hands. "They came to you directly?" she asked after he described the visit from Vargas. Jack nodded. "Made an offer, then implied threats when I refused." Maria's expression hardened. "The Suarez family has been fighting off people who want our land for 6 generations. First it was the Texas Rangers, then the oil companies, now the cartels. Different uniforms, same intent. The difference is, the cartels don't bother with legal paperwork when they're done waiting," Jack pointed out. "Los Hierros is patient, but they won't wait forever." "What's your assessment?" Maria asked, her directness reflecting their growing alliance. "Military to military. How do you read the situation?" Jack appreciated her cut-a-thekes approach. "They're establishing area dominance, surveillance, intelligence gathering, psychological operations. The offer is part of their playbook, gives them deniability if things escalate. We tried to be reasonable, they'll say. And when the offer expires?" "Increased pressure," Jack replied honestly. "Property damage initially, designed to look like accidents or random vandalism. If that doesn't work, more direct intimidation." Maria nodded, absorbing this without visible fear. "My father always said trouble comes in cycles along the border. The faces and names change, but the struggle remains the same." She looked directly at Jack. I won't sell either. Whatever happens, the Suarez ranch stays in the family. Then we need to coordinate, Jack said. Share information, establish communication protocols, prepare contingencies. For the next hour, they developed a mutual support plan, signals for emergencies, shared patrol schedules, backup communication methods if phones were compromised. The easy way they fell into tactical planning reminded Jack of mission prep sessions with fellow Marines. No wasted words, practical solutions, clear responsibilities. As dusk approached, Jack headed back to his ranch, taking an even more circuitous route to detect any surveillance. The setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape, transforming familiar terrain into a collection of potential hiding places. Jack's training automatically identified defensible positions, cleared fields of fire, covered approach routes, mapping the battle space before battle was joined. Because that was what was coming, Jack realized with grim certainty. Not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but soon. The Los Hierros cartel hadn't built their reputation through bluffs and retreats. They wanted this territory and were committing significant resources to acquire it. When their offer expired unaccepted, they would escalate. The question wasn't if conflict would come to his land, but when, and whether Jack Harmon, who had survived the crucibles of Fallujah and Helmand Province, was ready to defend his home with the same determination he had once defended distant outposts in the name of his country. The 48-hour deadline passed without further contact from Colonel Vargas. Jack hadn't expected them to simply walk away, but the silence was more concerning than immediate action would have been. In his experience, the quiet before an operation often indicated methodical planning rather than retreat. On the third morning after Vargas's visit, Jack awoke to the smell of smoke. He was moving before his conscious mind had fully processed the information, grabbing his sidearm from beside the bed and heading toward the window in a low crouch. Basic room-clearing procedure ingrained through countless combat exercises. In the pre-dawn gray, flames licked skyward from his eastern barn, the largest outbuilding on the property, where he stored hay, equipment, and his backup generator. Methodical assessment trumped immediate reaction. Jack scanned the surrounding area through his rifle scope before rushing out, checking for the ambush that often accompanied such diversionary tactics. Seeing no immediate threat, Jack sprinted to the barn, the disciplined calm of combat operations taking over. The fire had been strategically set, multiple points of origin, focused on the load-bearing structures. Not random vandalism, but calculated destruction. The accelerant smell confirmed it, professional arson. The flames had already consumed too much of the structure to save it. Jack diverted his attention to preventing spread to nearby buildings, using the ranch's water pump to wet down adjacent structures while maintaining situational awareness of his surroundings. This was likely phase one of an operation: create chaos, observe response patterns, identify vulnerabilities. As the barn collapsed in a shower of embers and cracking timber, Jack heard the distant sound of vehicles approaching. He moved to a defensive position behind his tractor, rifle ready but not yet raised. 3 pickup trucks appeared on the dirt road leading to his property, not the black SUV of Vargas and his associates, but local vehicles. Maria Suarez's red Ford led the small convoy, followed by Henry Weston's blue Dodge and another truck Jack recognized as belonging to the Johnson family from the next county. Saw the smoke from my place, Maria called as she jumped from her truck, a pump shotgun held casually but competently in her hands. Figured you might have company. Henry and the Johnsons, father and son, were similarly armed, their expressions grim as they surveyed the burning barn. The Border Patrol had trained local ranchers in a community defense program years ago, and while most days that training gathered dust, it hadn't been forgotten. Professional job, Jack said, nodding toward the barn as the neighbors gathered around. Multiple ignition points, accelerant used. Los Hierros? Maria asked, though it wasn't really a question. Jack nodded. They gave me 48 hours to accept their offer. Time expired last night. Bastards hit the Petersons last week, Rob Johnson said, his weathered face hard in the firelight. cut their water lines, shot 2 horses. Families pulling out, putting the ranch up for sale. The information settled like a weight on Jack's shoulders. Another family driven out, another property about to fall under cartel control. The pattern was expanding across the borderlands like an ink stain on fabric. They're establishing a corridor, Jack explained, his tactical mind mapping the strategic implications. Taking key properties along this stretch of border to create a controlled zone for their operations. The small group remained as the barn burned down to smoldering remains, a show of solidarity that spoke volumes in the isolated borderlands where self-reliance and mutual support were the only reliable safety nets. As dawn broke fully, they helped Jack salvage what equipment could be recovered and secure the site. "We've started night patrols," Henry informed Jack as they worked. 2-person teams, rotating schedule between the ranches. "Had to dust off the old CB radios since cell service out here is spotty, but it's working so far." Jack nodded his appreciation. The community was activating its own defense networks, exactly the kind of local initiative that had proven effective in counterinsurgency operations overseas. Control the territory, deny freedom of movement to hostile forces, establish early warning networks. By mid-morning, the neighbors had departed, promising to circle back later and help with cleanup. Jack studied the charred remains of his barn with a sniper's eye for detail, looking for any clues about the perpetrators. Near what had been the back entrance, he found what he was looking for, another iron nail bent into a circle, deliberately placed where it wouldn't be destroyed by the fire. Another calling card. Jack pocketed the symbol and returned to the house to call Carlos, the Border Patrol agent. The conversation was predictably frustrating. "I'll file the report, Jack, but unless we catch someone in the act, there's not much we can do officially. Arson investigation takes time we don't have with current staffing." "I know who did it," Jack replied evenly. Knowing and proving are different things in the legal system, Carlos reminded him. "I believe you, but my hands are tied by procedure." After ending the call, Jack methodically checked and reinforced his defenses. The barn fire was likely just the opening move, designed to rattle him, assess his response, engage local support. Los Hierros would be watching, analyzing, planning their next step. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the property, Jack's satellite phone rang, a secure line few people had the number for. "Harmon," he answered tersely. "Jack, it's Mike Reynolds." The voice belonged to a former Marine who had served with Jack in Afghanistan, now working with a private security contractor along the border. "Heard about your barn through the grapevine. Los Hierros getting frisky in your AO. Making their presence known," Jack confirmed. "You have information?" "Might. We're tracking an uptick in their activities across the sector. Word is El Arquitecto himself has taken an interest in expanding their corridor through your area specifically. Our sources say they've brought in additional personnel, professional hitters, not just the usual foot soldiers." The information aligned with Jack's own assessment. "Timeframe? Hard to pin down," Reynolds replied, "but they're not known for extended patience. I'd expect escalation within days, not weeks. Watch your six, Marine." "Always do. Thanks for the heads up." After ending the call, Jack continued his preparations with renewed urgency. He established fallback positions throughout the property, cached supplies and ammunition at strategic points, and set up additional layers of early warning devices. The defensive preparations were so familiar that Jack found himself transported back to Afghanistan in 2011, preparing a forward operating base in Helmand province for an anticipated Taliban offensive. The dust had been relentless, coating everything in a fine powder that worked its way into weapons, equipment, and lungs with equal determination. Staff Sergeant Harmon had moved among the Marine positions, checking fields of fire, adjusting overlapping coverage zones, verifying communication links. "They'll come from the east," he told the young lieutenant who'd been assigned to the outpost just 2 weeks earlier. "The terrain offers better cover, and the morning sun will be in our eyes." "How can you be so sure?" the lieutenant had asked, his face still unwrinkled by the harsh Afghan elements. "Because it's what I do," Jack had replied simply. "Always think like your opponent. see the battlefield through their eyes, then deny them what they want. That night, the Taliban had indeed attacked from the east, exactly as Jack had predicted. The prepared Marines had repelled the assault with minimal casualties, their defensive positions perfectly situated to counter the expected approach. Now, as darkness fell over his Texas ranch, Jack applied those same principles. If he were planning an assault on this property, where would he strike? What avenues of approach offered tactical advantages? Where were the vulnerabilities in his defenses? The ranch house itself was surprisingly defensible: stone walls, limited window exposure on the ground floor, clear fields of fire in multiple directions. The remaining outbuildings could provide cover for approaching forces, but also created choke points that could be turned against attackers. Jack worked through the night, sleep a forgotten luxury, as he established defensive measures with the focused intensity that had earned him commendations in combat zones. By dawn, he had transformed his civilian ranch into something resembling a tactical operations center, observation posts established, communications redundancies in place, defensive fallback positions prepared. As the sun crested the horizon, Jack finally allowed himself a brief rest, settling into a chair on his porch with a cup of coffee and his rifle within reach. The peaceful scene, golden light washing across his land, morning birds calling to each other, created a surreal contrast to the military preparations he'd spent the night implementing. The sound of an approaching vehicle drew his attention. A border patrol truck appeared on the dirt road, Carlos Mendez at the wheel. The agent parked and approached the house, his expression grave. "Thought you should know," Carlos said without preamble. "We found one of our remote sensors destroyed last night, the one covering the canyon approach about 5 miles south of here. Before it went offline, it captured images of multiple vehicles moving north." Jack absorbed this information with the calm assessment of a combat veteran. How many? At least 3 trucks, heavily loaded. Could be regular smuggling, could be something else. Both men knew what something else might entail. Los Hierros moving personnel and equipment into position for operations in the area. "There's more," Carlos continued, lowering his voice despite the isolation. "We've gotten reports of property damage at 3 other ranches in the area, all on the same night as your barn. Coordinated action, systematic." The tactical picture was becoming clearer. Los Hierros was establishing area dominance through coordinated intimidation, targeting multiple properties simultaneously to overwhelm response capabilities and isolate resistors. "I've requested additional patrols for the sector," Carlos added, "but you know how that goes. Resources are stretched thin everywhere." After Carlos departed, Jack received a call from Maria. Her voice was tight with controlled anger. "They hit my south pump house last night. Smashed the equipment, left their little iron symbol. Johnson's place too, cut his fence lines and scattered his cattle." "They're making a statement," Jack replied, "demonstrating control of the territory." "This isn't my first rodeo with people who want our land," Maria said firmly. "My grandfather faced down armed claim jumpers in the 40s. We're still here, they're not." Jack admired her resilience, but worried about the scale of what they were facing. Claim jumpers and local criminals were one thing. A sophisticated cartel with military-trained leadership was another entirely. "We need to coordinate our defenses," he told her. "This pattern suggests they're preparing for something bigger." Throughout the day, Jack monitored communications among the local ranch network, building a comprehensive picture of Los Hierros' activities. The pattern confirmed his analysis: systematic boundary testing, targeted property damage, surveillance of response capabilities. Classic preparation for territorial control operations. That night, Jack positioned himself in a concealed observation post on the ridge overlooking the most likely approach routes to his property. The quarter moon provided minimal illumination, but his night vision equipment compensated, transforming the darkness into shades of green and black. At 2:14 a.m., his patience was rewarded. 3 vehicles with headlights off moved slowly along the county road before turning onto the unmarked dirt track that led toward his property. Not border patrol or local law enforcement. They would have used marked routes and proper lighting. These were the visitors Jack had been expecting. Through his night vision scope, Jack counted 8 figures deploying from the vehicles, armed men moving with the coordinated precision of trained operators, not common criminals. They established a perimeter and began advancing toward his ranch house in tactical formation, using available cover effectively. Jack's mind flashed back to an operation in Iraq, where he'd observed insurgents using similar approach techniques, military training repurposed for criminal objectives. The memory sharpened his focus rather than distracting him. The night outside Fallujah had been similarly dark, the insurgent team advancing on the Marine position with comparable discipline. Staff Sergeant Harmon had remained motionless in his observation post, documenting their movement patterns before initiating contact. "Let them commit," he'd whispered to the young Marine beside him. "Reveal their full strength and approach routes before engaging." Now, applying those same battlefield lessons, Jack observed the cartel team's full deployment before activating his first defensive measure, a pre-positioned series of solar-powered lights connected to motion sensors, strategically placed to illuminate approach routes, while temporarily blinding anyone using night vision equipment. The sudden illumination froze the advancing team momentarily, disrupting their cohesion. Using their confusion, Jack triggered his second prepared countermeasure, a series of recorded sounds played through weather-protected speakers hidden around the property. The cacophony of barking dogs, radio chatter, and mechanical noises created the impression of multiple defenders mobilizing. The psychological operation bought Jack precious time to reposition to his primary defensive point, a reinforced shed with clear sightlines to the illuminated areas. From this position, he used a handheld radio to activate the ranch community alert network, sending a simple coded message that would mobilize the mutual defense partners without revealing tactical information to anyone monitoring communications. The cartel team regrouped quickly, their professional training evident in their response to the unexpected countermeasures. They adjusted their approach, using available cover to compensate for the loss of darkness advantage. Jack tracked their movements through his rifle scope, noting their distribution and weaponry, primarily automatic rifles with tactical accessories, indicative of well-funded criminal operations rather than opportunistic border gangs. When the lead elements reached the outer perimeter of his immediate defense zone, Jack initiated direct contact, firing a precisely aimed shot that impacted the ground 5 meters ahead of the point man. A warning shot, but one that demonstrated both capability and restraint. The response was immediate. The cartel team deployed to defensive positions, returning fire toward Jack's position with disciplined bursts rather than panicked volume. The exchange confirmed what Jack had suspected. These were trained combatants, not casual criminals. The tactics spoke of military or police background, their fire discipline and position selection revealing professional experience. For 20 minutes, the engagement remained at standoff distance. Probing fire exchanged without either side advancing or retreating. Jack maintained his disciplined conservation of ammunition, each shot placed with sniper precision to pin down rather than escalate. This wasn't about body count, it was about establishing boundaries and demonstrating capacity. The distant sound of approaching vehicles shifted the tactical equation. The ranch defense network responding to Jack's alert, incoming headlights visible on the main road. The cartel team leader recognized the changing situation, issuing orders that Jack couldn't hear but could interpret from the resulting movement, a tactical withdrawal, covered by sustained fire to mask their retreat. Within minutes, the cartel vehicles were moving away from the property, their departure as coordinated as their arrival had been. Jack maintained his vigilance, wary of deception operations or delayed action threats, until the approaching vehicles revealed themselves to be Maria Suarez's truck leading 3 others from neighboring ranches. "You okay?" Maria called as she approached Jack's position, her shotgun held at the ready. "They've withdrawn for now," Jack replied, his voice calm despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system. "Professional team, well-equipped, good tactics." Henry Weston emerged from his truck, a lever-action rifle in his hands that looked antique but was clearly well-maintained. Heard the shots from 3 miles out. Multiple weapons, controlled bursts. Not your typical border trash. Los Hierros, Jack confirmed. Testing defenses, assessing response capabilities. The neighbors established a perimeter and conducted a thorough check of the property, finding no casualties but discovering multiple shell casings from the cartel team's weapons, 7.62 millimeters and 5.56 millimeters, military standard ammunition. They also found a single brass casing of a different type, distinct from the others, a 7.62 x 54 mmR round, used in specialized sniper rifles of Russian origin. The presence of a precision marksman among the cartel team added another layer of concern to the already serious situation. By dawn, the immediate threat had passed, but Jack harbored no illusions about what the night's events represented. This wasn't an isolated incident, but the beginning of a campaign, Los Hierros testing his capabilities while gathering intelligence for their next move. The controlled nature of the engagement suggested they weren't yet committed to all-out assault, but rather escalating pressure designed to force compliance with their territorial objectives. The community response had been effective as a short-term countermeasure, but Jack recognized the strategic limitations. Los Hierros could choose the time and place of engagement, concentrating forces against isolated targets while the ranch defense network was spread across miles of rugged territory. Asymmetric advantage lay with the cartel's superior numbers and resources. As the neighbors departed with promises to maintain heightened alert status, Jack conducted a detailed assessment of the engagement zone. The cartel team had left behind more than shell casings. Their movement patterns revealed training and coordination that confirmed the intelligence about El Arquitecto's recruitment of former military personnel. They had probed his defenses systematically, testing response times and fire capabilities without fully committing their forces. Later that morning, Jack's satellite phone rang again. Mike Reynolds, his former Marine comrade, now working in border security. "Just got word of your visitors last night," Reynolds said without preamble. "Intercepts suggest it was a reconnaissanceian force, not their main effort." "Figured as much," Jack replied. "They were probing, not committing. Our sources indicate El Arquitecto is taking a personal interest in your situation. Apparently, your resistance has become a matter of reputation for Los Hierros." The information wasn't surprising, but carried significant implications. Cartel leadership typically remained insulated from frontline operations, directing activities through layers of subordinates. Direct involvement suggested escalation beyond routine territorial expansion. "There's more," Reynolds continued, his voice dropping slightly. "We've identified one of their key operators in your sector, former Mexican Special Forces captain named Vega. Tactical specialist, expert in rural operations. He was likely directing last night's probe." The name triggered immediate recognition. Captain Raul Vega had been mentioned in military intelligence briefings years earlier, identified as a high-value trainer for cartel enforcement teams before disappearing from official records. His presence confirmed the seriousness of Los Hierros' commitment to the operation. "Vega doesn't deploy for minor operations," Reynolds added. "If he's involved, they're planning something significant." After ending the call, Jack methodically repaired the minor damage from the night's engagement and refined his defensive preparations based on the observed cartel tactics. The presence of a professional sniper among their forces necessitated countermeasures, adjusted patrol routes, enhanced concealment at observation posts, reduced exposure times when moving between positions. By mid-afternoon, Jack had established an improvised command center in his reinforced cellar, radio equipment, area maps marked with observed cartel movements, and supplies sufficient for sustained operations. The preparations felt eerily familiar, transporting him back to another defensive operation years earlier. The Taliban had been probing the Marine outpost for 3 consecutive nights, testing response patterns and defensive capabilities before their main assault. Staff Sergeant Harmon had used the intelligence gathered from these probes to adjust defensive positions, creating interlocking fields of fire and pre-positioned response teams. They're showing us their playbook, he told his squad leaders during the pre-operation briefing. Our job is to change the game before they commit. The defensive adjustments had proven decisive when the main Taliban force attacked on the fourth night, encountering unexpected resistance at their planned breach points and pre-targeted response to their support positions. What had been intended as an overwhelming assault had deteriorated into a costly failure for the attackers. Now, applying those hard-won lessons to his current situation, Jack systematically identified likely cartel attack vectors based on their probe patterns and established countermeasures for each. The ranch's terrain offered natural defensive advantages when properly utilized, elevated positions with good visibility, natural choke points that could channel attackers into prepared fire zones, concealed movement routes between defensive positions. As evening approached, Jack called Maria to coordinate the night security operations. Johnson's place was hit while everyone was responding to your situation, she informed him, her voice tight with controlled anger. They burned his equipment shed and shot up his water tanks while he was helping you. The information fit the anticipated pattern: divide defensive resources, create multiple simultaneous pressure points to overwhelm response capabilities. Classic military tactics adapted for criminal objectives. They're trying to isolate targets, Jack explained. We need to adjust our response protocols, maintain minimum defensive presence at each property during external response. Already on it, Maria replied. We've established a rotation schedule. 2 defenders remain regardless of external calls. But we're stretched thin, Jack. 10 ranches in our network, most with minimal manpower. The resource limitations were a critical vulnerability, one that Los Hierros was clearly aware of and exploiting. The cartel could concentrate superior forces against selected targets while maintaining pressure across the entire area, forcing the defenders to spread limited resources across too wide a front. That night, Jack implemented enhanced security measures, random patrol patterns, varied observation positions, intermittent illumination of different approach sectors. Disrupting predictability was essential against an adversary studying response patterns for exploitation. At 1:38 a.m., one of his motion sensors activated, southern perimeter, the most exposed approach from the border. Jack moved to a pre-positioned observation point, using thermal imaging to scan the indicated sector. The signature was clear but unexpected, not multiple human figures, but a single heat source moving slowly toward the ranch house. The thermal profile suggested something mechanical rather than human. The realization struck just as the unattended vehicle crested a small rise 200 meters from the main house, an improvised assault vehicle, likely remote-controlled or programmed for autonomous operation. The crude but effective device consisted of a farm ATV loaded with what appeared to be fuel containers and commercial explosives, guided toward its target by basic navigation systems. Jack had seen similar devices in Iraq, insurgents using remote-controlled vehicles laden with explosives to breach compound defenses or create diversionary attacks. The tactic was effective precisely because it forced defenders to respond without risking attackers. Working quickly, Jack positioned himself to disable the vehicle with minimal risk of detonating its payload. A precision shot to the front axle might immobilize it without triggering the explosives. He steadied his breathing, centered his scope's crosshairs on the target point, and squeezed the trigger with the controlled pressure that had made him an exceptional marksman. The impact was immediate. The vehicle lurched as its steering mechanism failed, veering off course and coming to rest in a shallow depression 50 meters from its apparent target. Jack maintained his position, scanning surrounding areas for the control team that would likely be observing the operation from a safe distance. Thermal imaging revealed 2 heat signatures approximately 300 meters beyond the immobilized vehicle, human figures in concealed observation positions, likely the control team for the improvised attack. Jack considered his options carefully. Direct engagement might trigger a larger assault force waiting nearby, while inaction could allow the operators to adjust their plan or detonate the vehicle remotely. The decision was made for him when one of the figures emerged from cover, apparently moving to manually adjust the stalled vehicle's path. Jack keyed his radio, activating the prearranged alert to the nearest response team, then settled into his shooting position with practiced focus. The approaching figure moved with the caution of experienced operators, using available cover and varying his approach pattern to minimize exposure. Through his scope, Jack identified tactical gear and what appeared to be a remote detonator in the man's hand, confirmation of imminent threat that justified defensive action. Jack's shot was precise, center mass, maximum stopping probability with minimized risk of sympathetic detonation of the vehicle's payload. The figure dropped immediately, the detonator falling from his hand. The second observer opened fire from his position, suppressing Jack's location with controlled bursts that suggested professional training. For several minutes, Jack exchanged disciplined fire with the second operator, each seeking advantage without unnecessary exposure. The engagement demonstrated the quality of personnel Los Hierros had deployed, not common criminals but trained combatants with tactical discipline and effective equipment. The distant sound of approaching vehicles signaled the ranch defense network responding to Jack's alert. The second cartel operator recognized the changing tactical situation and disengaged, withdrawing into the darkness with professional discipline. When the response team arrived, Maria Suarez and Rob Johnson in separate vehicles, Jack briefed them on the encounter while maintaining security against potential secondary attacks. The immobilized vehicle remained a threat, its payload requiring careful assessment before approaching. "We need EOD capabilities," Jack explained, referring to explosive ordnance disposal specialists. "That vehicle is still dangerous." "Nearest bomb squad is 2 hours out, minimum," Johnson replied. "And that's if they respond at all to a rural call without confirmed explosives." The tactical problem was familiar to Jack from his deployment experiences: suspected IEDs, improvised explosive devices, requiring assessment and neutralization with limited specialized support. He had received basic counter-IED training during his Marine career, but this situation demanded specialized knowledge he respected enough not to improvise with. "We establish a security perimeter and wait for daylight," he decided. "Better visibility, better response options if something goes wrong." The remainder of the night passed without further incident, the defense team maintaining vigilant security around the disabled vehicle while monitoring for additional cartel movement. By dawn, they had been joined by Carlos Mendez and 2 additional Border Patrol agents, drawn by reports of the engagement. "This is escalation," Carlos observed grimly as they examined the vehicle from a safe distance. "Vehicle-borne IEDs aren't typical cartel tactics around here." "Los Hierros isn't a typical cartel," Jack replied. "El Arquitecto brings military methodologies to criminal objectives." The Border Patrol's assessment confirmed Jack's initial analysis. The vehicle contained sufficient explosives to cause significant structural damage to the ranch house, likely intended as a decisive statement rather than merely another act of intimidation. The presence of remote detonation capabilities and secondary trigger mechanisms demonstrated sophisticated planning beyond typical criminal operations. With the immediate threat neutralized, Jack conducted a comprehensive assessment of the night's events. The attack represented significant escalation, transitioning from intimidation and property damage to potentially lethal force. The timing suggested impatience with the pace of territorial acquisition, possibly driven by leadership pressure for results. Most concerning was the tactical sophistication displayed: coordinated reconnaissance, technical capabilities for remote operations, professional operators with combat discipline. Los Hierros was deploying military-grade capabilities against civilian targets, creating an asymmetric threat environment that conventional law enforcement was ill-equipped to counter. As Jack documented the attack details for his growing intelligence file, the tactical reality became increasingly clear. This wasn't merely criminal activity, but something approaching insurgency tactics: systematic territorial control through targeted violence, intimidation of civilian populations, and degradation of government security capabilities. The parallels to counterinsurgency operations he conducted overseas were disturbing but instructive. Los Hierros hadn't yet committed their full capabilities, suggesting this was still an escalating campaign rather than their culminating effort. The probe attacks and improvised assault vehicle were testing operations, gathering intelligence while applying pressure. The main effort was still being prepared, likely a coordinated operation designed to break resistance across multiple properties simultaneously. Jack Harmon had faced such situations before, defending outposts against determined adversaries with superior numbers. The principles remained the same whether in the mountains of Afghanistan or the borderlands of Texas: know your terrain, maintain situational awareness, anticipate enemy actions, and control the tempo of engagement whenever possible. The coming confrontation would test everything he had learned through 5 combat deployments, applying hard-won battlefield wisdom to defend not a military outpost but his home and community. And unlike his deployments, there would be no reinforcements, no close air support, no medevac capabilities, just a former Marine and a scattered network of neighbors facing a well-equipped criminal force with military training and territorial ambitions. As Jack watched Border Patrol technicians carefully neutralize the explosives from the disabled vehicle, he felt the familiar calm that had always preceded significant combat operations during his military career. Not the absence of fear, but its transformation into focused determination. The coming days would bring Los Hierros' main effort against his property, testing his defenses and resolve with everything they could bring to bear. They would find, as others had before them in distant battlefields, that Jack Harmon's quiet demeanor masked a formidable defensive specialist who transformed disadvantageous terrain into killing grounds for those foolish enough to assault his positions. The ranch might seem like isolated, vulnerable territory to cartel strategists, but in reality, Los Hierros was advancing into carefully prepared defensive zones established by a Marine who had spent his military career making similar calculations from the other perspective. The cartel had made a critical error in their strategic assessment, mistaking Jack's civilian appearance for civilian capabilities. They would learn, as Taliban and insurgent forces had before them, the cost of that miscalculation. The following day brought oppressive heat, the kind that seemed to press down on the Texas landscape like a physical weight. Jack moved methodically through his preparations, the sweat-damp shirt clinging to his back as he reinforced defensive positions and cached additional supplies at strategic points around the property. The weather forecast called for a severe thunderstorm system moving in from the Gulf, a tactical complication that could either hinder or help, depending on how it was leveraged. Jack's satellite phone rang just after noon. Mike Reynolds' voice came through with the distinct tension of urgent intelligence. "Just intercepted communications you need to know about," Reynolds said without preamble. El Arquitecto has authorized a full clearance operation in your sector. Multiple teams mobilizing, heavy weapons approved. Timeline is immediate, likely tonight. Jack absorbed this information with the calm assessment that had kept him alive through 5 combat deployments. Numbers and capabilities? At least 20 operators split into 3 assault teams. They've brought in specialists from their Tamaulipas branch, former military with urban warfare experience. Equipment includes squad automatic weapons, possibly RPGs or similar anti-structure munitions. The force composition indicated this wasn't merely another intimidation attempt but a commitment to decisive action, El Arquitecto moving from pressure tactics to full territorial acquisition. "There's more," Reynolds continued, his voice dropping slightly. "Vega is personally leading the operation. Intel suggests he's taking this as a matter of professional pride, the former Marine who's disrupting their corridor." Jack had expected escalation, but the scale and timeline accelerated the strategic situation significantly. The cartel was committing substantial resources to eliminate resistance in the border region, with his ranch as the primary target. "Any support available?" Jack asked, though he already knew the answer. "Official channels are constrained by jurisdictional protocols," Reynolds replied, using careful language on an unsecured line. "Border Patrol is aware but stretched across multiple hot zones. Local law enforcement lacks the manpower for this threat profile." In military terms, you're on your own. Understood. Thanks for the heads up. After ending the call, Jack immediately activated the ranch defense network, transmitting the intelligence through their secure channel and initiating the prearranged contingency plans. The response was immediate but concerning, several ranches reporting suspicious activities along their perimeters, suggesting Los Hierros was simultaneously pressuring multiple properties to prevent mutual support during the main operation. Maria Suarez confirmed this assessment when she arrived at Jack's ranch 30 minutes later, her expression grim as they consulted over maps spread across his kitchen table. "They've got teams watching the main roads between our properties," she reported. "Johnson tried to head this way and spotted a roadblock on County Line Road, unmarked vehicles, armed men. He backed off before they engaged." The tactical picture was becoming clear. Los Hierros was implementing textbook isolation operations, cutting off potential reinforcement routes while preparing their main assault force. Jack had seen similar tactics in Afghanistan, Taliban forces isolating outlying villages before launching coordinated attacks on coalition outposts. "They're serious this time," Jack observed, marking the reported roadblock positions on his map. "Full-spectrum operation with proper support elements." Maria nodded, her ranch-uffened hands steady as she traced potential approach routes. "What's the plan? Fall back to a more defensible position?" "The Weston place has that old stone barn that could serve as a strong point." Jack considered the tactical options with the methodical thoroughness that had defined his military career. Consolidation at a central defensive position offered certain advantages: concentrated firepower, simplified security perimeter, optimized resource allocation. But it also surrendered initiative and territory to the cartel, allowing them to establish area dominance while the defenders adopted a reactive posture. "No," he decided after careful consideration. "That's what they want, to push us into a defensive concentration they can isolate and overwhelm. We maintain distributed resistance, deny them freedom of movement across the entire area." The strategy was risky given their limited manpower, but it aligned with counterinsurgency principles Jack had applied successfully overseas. Deny the enemy clear targets, maintain presence throughout contested territory, leverage superior knowledge of terrain against numeric disadvantages. As the afternoon progressed, Jack coordinated with the ranch defense network to establish a comprehensive security system, observation posts at strategic locations, communication protocols that didn't rely on potentially compromised channels, pre-designated rally points if withdrawal became necessary. The preparations weren't merely defensive, they incorporated active measures designed to shape the battlefield before Los Hierros could initiate their operation. By late afternoon, dark thunderclouds had gathered on the horizon, distant lightning illuminating their imposing mass. The approaching storm would add another tactical dimension to the coming confrontation: limited visibility, degraded electronic systems, altered acoustics that could mask movement. Jack incorporated these factors into his planning, positioning assets to leverage the changing conditions rather than be hindered by them. For hours before sunset, Jack conducted a final briefing with the core members of the ranch defense network who had managed to reach his property before Los Hierros fully implemented their isolation measures. The group was small but determined: Maria Suarez, Henry Weston, and the Johnson father-son team who had circumvented the cartel roadblocks by using old cattle trails between the properties. "Based on intelligence and observed patterns, we can expect multiple assault teams approaching from different vectors," Jack explained, indicating likely routes on his terrain map. "Their objective is territorial control, not mere intimidation. They'll have superior numbers and firepower, but we have advantages they can't match: intimate knowledge of the terrain, prepared positions, and defensive integration." The briefing felt eerily familiar, transporting Jack back to similar moments before combat operations in distant war zones. Different setting, different adversary, but the same fundamental principles of warfare in play. "We operate in distributed defense mode," he continued, outlining individual responsibilities and coordination protocols. "Maintain observation without engagement unless directly threatened. Our primary objective is intelligence gathering and target identification. Locate their command elements and support positions before they can establish operational momentum. As the defenders moved to their assigned positions, the first heavy raindrops began to fall, quickly intensifying into a driving downpour that reduced visibility and turned the dusty ground to mud. Thunder rolled across the landscape like artillery fire, lightning providing brief, stark illumination of the terrain. The weather was both complication and opportunity, degrading surveillance capabilities for both sides while providing natural sound masking for movement. Jack established his primary control position in a reinforced storm cellar adjacent to the main ranch house, a position that offered protection, communication links to the distributed defensive elements, and a fallback option if the main structure was compromised. From this position, he coordinated the ranch defense network through encrypted radio channels, building a comprehensive picture of cartel movements as observation posts reported activity. The first contact came 90 minutes after sunset, an observation post on the eastern ridge reporting vehicle movement along the county road, headlights extinguished to maintain operational security. 3 trucks moving slowly toward the ranch access road, stopping approximately 1 kilometer from the property boundary to offload personnel. At least 12 individuals deploying in tactical formation, Henry Weston reported from his observation position. Standard equipment plus what looks like support weapons, probably squad automatic or similar. They're establishing a staging area in the Dry Creek bed. Jack documented the information on his tactical map, correlating it with reports from other observation posts to build a comprehensive picture of the cartel operation. The pattern was professional and methodical, establishing support positions before committing main assault elements, positioning observer teams to provide targeting data, securing likely counterattack routes. The operation bore the unmistakable signature of military planning. Vega's influence evident in the disciplined approach and proper tactical sequencing. This wasn't a criminal gang conducting an intimidation raid, but a quasi-military force implementing a territorial control operation with professional competence. As the cartel teams continued their methodical deployment, Jack's radio crackled with Maria's voice from her observation post covering the southern approach. Command element identified, she reported tersely. 3 vehicles just arrived at the staging area. Center vehicle is armored SUV, distinctive antenna configuration. 2 individuals deployed with security detail, 1 matches Vega's description from your intelligence briefing. The identification of the command element was a critical intelligence gain, allowing Jack to focus counter-efforts on the operations control node rather than just responding to frontline assault teams. In military operations, disrupting command and control capabilities often proved more decisive than engaging combat elements directly. Maintain observation, do not engage, Jack instructed. Priority is pattern recognition and communication mapping. For the next hour, the defenders monitored cartel deployment activities, documenting movement patterns, equipment distribution, and communication protocols. The intelligence gathered confirmed Jack's assessment, a professional operation with proper support elements and command structure, implementing textbook security zone establishment before committing to main objective assault. The storm intensified as the cartel completed their preparations, rain falling in blinding sheets driven by gusting winds. Lightning strikes illuminated the landscape in stark flashes, thunder providing natural sound masking that both complicated surveillance and created tactical opportunities. Jack incorporated the evolving weather conditions into his defensive planning, adjusting timing and positioning to leverage the natural elements. At precisely 10:42 p.m., the cartel initiated their operation, coordinated movement from multiple approach vectors, maintaining disciplined tactical spacing despite the challenging weather conditions. The assault teams advanced methodically toward the ranch perimeter, using available terrain features for concealment, while support elements established overwatch positions with crew-served weapons. Jack monitored the approach through remote observation systems, comparing the actual movement patterns to predicted routes and identifying deviations that might indicate adaptive tactical thinking. The cartel operators moved with professional discipline, maintaining proper security while advancing. Further confirmation that Los Hierros had deployed their elite personnel for this operation. When the lead elements reached the first defensive trigger line Jack had established, he implemented the initial phase of his counterplan, activating prepositioned deterrent measures designed to disrupt the cartel's operational tempo without immediately revealing defender positions. Solar-powered lights concealed around the property perimeter activated simultaneously, creating momentary disorientation among the advancing cartel teams. This was immediately followed by strategically positioned sound devices broadcasting recorded tactical communications through weather-protected speakers, creating the impression of a larger, more distributed defensive force. The psychological operation achieved its intended effect, causing the cartel teams to hesitate and regroup, uncertain of what they were facing. That momentary disruption provided the defenders with valuable intelligence, revealing command protocols as team leaders communicated with their control element, identifying specialized operators by their response patterns, and confirming equipment capabilities as they adjusted to the changing tactical environment. Rather than immediately engaging with direct fire, Jack continued the disruption strategy, triggering secondary deterrent measures at irregular intervals to prevent the cartel teams from establishing operational rhythm. Motion-activated noise generators, strategically placed lights with independent timing systems, and prepositioned pyrotechnic devices created a disorienting defensive environment that degraded the attacker's cohesion without revealing defender positions. The cartel response demonstrated their professional training. Rather than panicking or withdrawing, they adjusted their approach tactics, establishing security positions while reconnaissance elements probed for actual defensive locations. This adaptive response confirmed Jack's assessment of the adversary quality. These weren't common criminals, but trained operators implementing proper tactical procedures. As the cartel teams reorganized for a more deliberate approach, Jack observed a distinctive figure directing operations from a covered position near the command vehicles. A tall man with the unmistakable bearing of professional military leadership, issuing commands with controlled gestures that suggested experience and authority. Captain Raul Vega, personally supervising the operation against the former Marine who had disrupted Los Hierros' territorial expansion. The identification of Vega provided Jack with critical targeting information, the operations command node now confirmed and located. In military operations, removing leadership elements often proved more decisive than engaging frontline forces, particularly when those leaders possessed specialized capabilities difficult to replace. As the cartel assault teams resumed their advance with adjusted tactics, Jack implemented the second phase of his defensive plan, limited direct engagement from prepared positions, designed to channel the attackers into pre-designated zones rather than stop their advance entirely. Selective, precisely aimed fire from concealed positions forced the cartel teams to adjust their routes, unconsciously following paths that led them into tactical disadvantage. The ranch defenders maintained strict fire discipline, engaging only when presented with clear targets and immediately repositioning after firing to prevent effective counter-targeting. The technique was one Jack had perfected in Afghanistan, creating the impression of a larger defensive force through disciplined fire and position rotation. Los Hierros operators responded with professional competence, establishing suppressive fire patterns while maneuvering to flank identified firing positions. Their tactical coordination revealed extensive training and operational experience. These were combat veterans applying military methodologies to criminal objectives. For 45 minutes, the engagement continued in this manner, measured defensive fire channeling the attackers into predetermined approaches, cartel teams adjusting with professional discipline but unconsciously following the pathways Jack had intended them to take. The ranch's terrain features, thoroughly mapped and integrated into the defensive plan, gradually funneled the attackers into a natural depression that offered apparent cover while actually creating a vulnerable concentration. When approximately half the cartel assault force had been drawn into this position, Jack initiated the decisive phase of his counter-operation, triggering prepared defensive measures specifically designed for this tactical moment. Pre-positioned lighting systems activated simultaneously, illuminating the depression from multiple angles and temporarily disorienting the concentrated cartel operators. In the critical seconds following this disorientation, the ranch defenders executed a coordinated fire plan from multiple prepared positions overlooking the depression. The interlocking fields of fire created a devastating effect on the concentrated cartel force, precision shots from elevated positions with clear firing lanes. Exactly as Jack had trained Marine fire teams to deliver in similar tactical situations overseas. The impact was immediate and substantial, multiple cartel operators neutralized in the initial volley, others diving for inadequate cover within the now illuminated depression. What had appeared to be advantageous terrain was revealed as a carefully prepared kill zone, with defensive positions specifically sited to maximize effectiveness against forces within that area. Jack observed the operation through thermal imaging, directing adjustments to the defensive fire pattern as the situation evolved. The defenders maintained strict discipline, engaging only confirmed hostile targets and conserving ammunition with carefully placed shots rather than suppressive volume. The cartel response demonstrated their professional capabilities. Even under intense fire, the operators maintained communication and began implementing proper extraction procedures, establishing covering positions to facilitate withdrawal from the compromised location. This wasn't the panicked retreat of common criminals, but the disciplined response of trained combatants executing tactical recovery protocols. As the cartel assault force began their withdrawal from the kill zone, Jack observed increased activity around the command vehicles, Vega personally directing a reorganization of forces, consolidating remaining operators for a secondary approach while establishing heavy weapons positions to support the new advance. The tactical adjustment indicated both professional competence and determination to achieve objectives despite initial setbacks. Jack recognized the evolving threat profile and adjusted his defensive planning accordingly. The initial success had disrupted the cartel operation but not defeated it. Vega was reorganizing for a more concentrated effort, likely focusing on a single approach vector with maximum available firepower. The next phase would test the defenders' capabilities against a more determined and focused assault. The storm that had been building throughout the engagement now reached its peak intensity, driving rain reducing visibility to meters, wind gusting with enough force to affect ballistics, lightning strikes creating momentary blindness followed by enhanced darkness. The extreme weather conditions altered the tactical environment significantly, introducing variables that both complicated planning and created opportunities. Jack integrated these conditions into his defensive adjustments, repositioning assets to leverage the weather effects while minimizing their impact on defender capabilities. The ranch's terrain features, thoroughly mapped and prepared, offered alternative defensive positions specifically selected for effectiveness during adverse weather conditions. As the cartel forces completed their reorganization, a massive lightning strike hit the ridge line directly behind Jack's position, momentarily illuminating the entire battlefield with stark clarity before plunging it back into rain-soaked darkness. In that brief flash of illumination, Jack observed Vega personally leading the consolidated assault force toward a new approach vector, bypassing the previous engagement area to exploit an apparent gap in the defensive coverage. The selected approach revealed Vega's tactical acumen, identifying the most vulnerable sector in the defensive perimeter and concentrating force against it rather than dispersing assets across multiple avenues. Under conventional circumstances, the maneuver might have succeeded in penetrating the defenses. But Jack had anticipated precisely this tactical adjustment, preparing specific countermeasures for this scenario. As the cartel assault force advanced along their new approach, Jack implemented his contingency plan, activating pre-positioned defensive measures designed specifically to counter concentrated force against that sector. Remotely triggered pyrotechnics suddenly illuminated the advancing cartel operators from multiple angles, while strategically placed speakers broadcast recorded tactical communications suggesting defender reinforcement of the threatened sector. The psychological operation created momentary hesitation in the cartel advance, not panic, but professional reassessment of the tactical situation. That brief operational pause gave the ranch defenders critical time to adjust their positions, establishing interlocking fields of fire covering the cartel's new approach vector. When the assault resumed, the defenders were prepared coordinated fire from multiple concealed positions, creating a devastating effect on the advancing force. What had appeared to be a vulnerable sector was revealed as a deliberately constructed killing ground, with defensive positions specifically sited to maximize effectiveness against forces approaching from that direction. The intensity of the engagement escalated dramatically, with cartel operators returning disciplined fire while continuing their advance despite mounting casualties. This wasn't mere criminal determination but professional military resolve, Vega pushing his force forward with tactical purpose despite the defensive fires. Jack observed the operation through thermal imaging, directing defensive adjustments as the situation evolved. The cartel's tactical discipline remained impressive even under intense pressure. Operators maintaining proper spacing, establishing covering positions, implementing textbook assault procedures against a defended position. As the engagement reached critical intensity, a thunderous explosion erupted from the cartel's support position. A rocket-propelled grenade launched toward the main ranch house, impacting with a concussive blast that shattered windows and ignited a portion of the structure. The escalation to heavy weapons signaled Vega's commitment to achieving objectives regardless of cost, transitioning from tactical infiltration to direct assault. Jack had anticipated this escalation, prepositioning critical resources away from the main structure and establishing alternative command positions throughout the property. The ranch house, while symbolically significant, held minimal tactical importance in his defensive plan, its apparent vulnerability deliberately incorporated to draw enemy focus away from actual critical positions. As flames began to spread through a portion of the ranch house, the cartel assault force increased their operational tempo, advancing with greater urgency while maintaining tactical discipline. Vega was visible among the front elements, personally directing the assault with the confidence of a professional combat leader committed to objective achievement. The moment had arrived for Jack's decisive counter. While the cartel focused on the burning ranch house and the apparent defensive collapse it represented, Jack activated his final defensive measure, a comprehensive, coordinated response from concealed positions specifically sited to engage forces fixated on the structure. The ranch defenders executed their fire plan with precision born of preparation and discipline, interlocking fields of fire from multiple angles, creating a devastating effect on the concentrated assault force. What had appeared to be defensive disintegration was revealed as a deliberate tactical draw, pulling the attackers into a pre-designated kill zone optimized for defender effectiveness. The impact was immediate and substantial, multiple cartel operators neutralized in the initial volley, others diving for inadequate cover within the now compromised position. Even with professional discipline, the assault force couldn't maintain operational cohesion under such precisely delivered defensive fires. In the center of the chaos, Jack identified Vega through his thermal scope, the cartel commander attempting to rally his forces despite the deteriorating tactical situation. The former Mexican Special Forces officer's training was evident even in crisis, implementing proper casualty collection procedures while establishing covering positions to facilitate withdrawal. Jack had a clear shot at the cartel commander, center mass, high probability of neutralization. His finger tensed on the trigger, years of combat sniper training automatically calculating windage and elevation despite the driving rain. The elimination of Vega would likely collapse the entire cartel operation, removing the leadership element that provided tactical cohesion. In that crucial moment, Jack made a calculated decision. adjusting his aim to impact near Vega's position rather than engaging the commander directly. The precision shot struck the ground 2 meters from the cartel leader, sending a deliberate message rather than delivering a lethal outcome. This wasn't about body count but strategic objective achievement, demonstrating capability while preserving legal position. Vega recognized the implication immediately, a professional combat veteran understanding that he had been deliberately spared by someone with the capability to have eliminated him. The cartel commander issued rapid commands to his remaining operators, implementing a tactical withdrawal rather than continuing the now compromised assault. The cartel forces executed their withdrawal with the discipline of trained combatants, establishing covering positions, retrieving wounded, maintaining tactical spacing despite the pressure. This wasn't a panicked retreat but a professional disengagement, acknowledging tactical defeat while preserving operational capabilities. Jack maintained defensive pressure throughout the withdrawal, directing precisely aimed fire to accelerate the cartel's departure without maximizing casualties. The objective wasn't destruction but territorial defense, establishing unequivocal boundaries while demonstrating the prohibitive cost of future incursions. As the cartel forces completed their withdrawal, the storm reached its crescendo, lightning striking repeatedly across the landscape, thunder rolling continuously like distant artillery. Rain falling with such intensity that it seemed to form a physical barrier between the defenders and the retreating attackers. Nature itself providing final emphasis to the tactical outcome. When the last cartel vehicle disappeared into the rain-soaked darkness, Jack maintained full defensive posture, wary of deception operations or delayed action threats. Only after comprehensive security sweeps confirmed the attacker's departure did he authorize recovery operations, directing the ranch defenders to secure the engagement area while tending to property damage. The ranch house had sustained significant damage from the RPG impact and subsequent fire, portions of the structure still burning despite the driving rain. Outbuildings showed evidence of combat, bullet impacts, shattered windows, structural damage from the intense engagement. But the property remained under defender control, the territorial boundary maintained against determined assault. As dawn approached, the storm gradually subsided, revealing the full impact of the night's events. Shell casings littered the engagement areas, abandoned equipment marked cartel positions. Blood trails indicated casualties extracted during the withdrawal. The physical evidence told the story of a professional military operation that had encountered unexpected resistance and ultimately failed to achieve its objectives. Carlos Mendez arrived with Border Patrol reinforcements shortly after sunrise, having finally broken through the cartel roadblocks that had isolated the area during the engagement. The agent's expression reflected both concern and admiration as he surveyed the battlefield. "We picked up 9 wounded cartel operators at checkpoints heading south," he informed Jack. "Plus intelligence suggests they evacuated at least that many more through alternative routes. Significant casualties." Jack nodded, processing this information without satisfaction or regret, simply acknowledging the tactical outcome. They were professional. Military trained, proper equipment, good leadership. "The leadership is what concerns me," Carlos replied, lowering his voice slightly. "Our sources confirm El Arquitecto personally authorized this operation, with Vega in direct command. Los Hierros committed elite resources to this effort. They don't accept failure gracefully." The implication was clear. While the immediate assault had been repelled, the strategic situation remained unresolved. Los Hierros had demonstrated both capability and determination, and their territorial objectives hadn't changed despite the tactical setback. As the Border Patrol team documented the engagement scene, collecting evidence and recording damage assessments, Jack conducted his own analysis of the operation with the methodical thoroughness that had defined his military career. The defenders had prevailed against superior numbers through preparation, position selection, and disciplined execution, leveraging intimate knowledge of terrain against the attackers' greater resources. More significantly, They had demonstrated to Los Hierros the prohibitive cost of territorial acquisition in this sector, establishing credible deterrence through performance rather than mere threat. The cartel had expected to face unorganized civilian resistance and instead encountered professional defensive capabilities that neutralized their military advantages. While surveying the damaged ranch house, portions still smoldering despite the night's downpour, Jack noticed something deliberately placed on the front porch railing, a bent iron nail forming a circle, positioned to be clearly visible. Another Los Hierros calling card, but with a different implication than previous versions. The message was clear without words, acknowledgement from one professional to another, recognition of the engagement's outcome while simultaneously signaling that the broader conflict remained active. Vega's personal signature, communicating respect without concession. Jack pocketed the symbol without comment, adding it to his growing collection of cartel artifacts. The tactical engagement had been resolved, but the strategic situation remained fluid. Los Hierros had committed significant resources to this territorial objective and would likely reassess rather than abandon their campaign. Later that morning, as the ranch defenders congregated at Maria's property to assess outcomes and plan next steps, the full impact of the night's events became apparent. The ranch network had withstood a coordinated assault by professional operators with military capabilities, establishing credible defensive presence throughout the contested territory despite being significantly outnumbered. They didn't expect what they encountered, Jack explained to the assembled neighbors, his voice steady despite fatigue from the extended engagement. They prepared for civilian resistance and encountered something closer to military defense. Henry Weston nodded, cleaning his rifle with practiced hands that showed no tremor despite his 60-plus years. Cartel's used to intimidating ranchers, not fighting Marines who've turned their property into a tactical operation zone. The observation captured the essential dynamic that had shaped the engagement's outcome. Los Hierros had failed to properly assess their adversary, mistaking Jack's civilian status for civilian capabilities. They had prepared to overcome standard ranch security measures and instead encountered defensive preparations drawn from 5 combat deployments worth of hard-won battlefield wisdom. What remained uncertain was how Los Hierros would respond to this setback. Professional military organizations typically conducted detailed after-action reviews, identifying failures while adapting strategies for subsequent operations. The cartel, despite its criminal nature, operated with similar methodologies under Vega and El Arquitecto's leadership. "They'll be back," Maria stated matter-of-factly, the observation reflecting practical assessment rather than fear. Different approach, adjusted tactics, but the same objective. Jack agreed with her analysis. Los Hierros had committed too many resources to this territorial corridor to abandon it after a single setback. The next engagement would likely feature adapted tactics based on lessons from the failed assault, perhaps more emphasis on standoff weapons, different approach vectors, or alternative pressure methods beyond direct confrontation. What had changed fundamentally was the cartel's understanding of what they faced, no longer perceiving the ranch network as easily intimidated civilians but recognizing the defensive capabilities established throughout the territory. That recognition would shape their subsequent operations, introducing complications to their territorial acquisition strategy. As the day progressed, Jack coordinated repair operations at his damaged ranch while maintaining enhanced security measures throughout the property. The tactical victory had been significant but incomplete, demonstrating defensive capability without resolving the underlying strategic situation. Los Hierros remained determined to establish control over this border corridor, with resources and resolve that wouldn't be deterred by a single unsuccessful operation. The confrontation had revealed Jack Harmon's true capabilities to friend and foe alike. Not merely a retired Marine living quietly on his family ranch, but a combatist defensive specialist who transformed vulnerable terrain into denial zones for even professional military operators. The quiet rancher had demonstrated the full extent of his battlefield experience, implementing counterinsurgency principles developed across 5 combat deployments to defend his home territory. The question now was how that revelation would shape the ongoing conflict, Los Hierros adapting their approach based on accurate assessment of their adversary. The ranch defense network leveraging demonstrated capabilities to maintain territorial integrity. The battle lines had been drawn not merely across physical terrain but in the strategic calculations of both sides. The days following the confrontation brought a strange calm to Jack's damaged ranch. Local law enforcement and federal agencies descended on the property, documenting evidence and recording statements with bureaucratic thoroughness. Shell casings were collected, impact patterns photographed, and official reports filed with appropriate authorities. The formal process of converting a battlefield back into recognized civilian territory. Jack observed these proceedings with detached professionalism, providing precise accounts of the engagement without embellishment or justification. His military experience had prepared him for this aspect of conflict resolution. The administrative aftermath that followed tactical operations, transforming combat events into documented incidents categorized by official policy. "You've got quite a situation here, Mr. Harmon," stated the FBI agent who had arrived to assess potential federal jurisdiction. His crisp suit and carefully neutral expression contrasted sharply with the mud-splattered Border Patrol officers still processing the scene. 20-plus armed cartel members engaging a civilian property with military weaponry that moves beyond typical border incursion metrics. Jack nodded without commenting. The bureaucratic classification of the event meant little compared to its practical implications. Los Hierros had committed substantial resources to territorial acquisition and failed, but remained capable of adapting their approach for subsequent attempts. "Your background complicates the narrative," the agent continued, studying Jack with professional assessment. Former Marine with extensive combat experience implementing defensive operations against cartel incursion. Some might view that through a vigilante lens rather than legitimate self-defense. "The cartel initiated the engagement," Jack replied evenly. "We defended legally owned property against armed intruders. The tactical methods employed don't change the fundamental legal position." The agent's slight smile acknowledged the precision of Jack's response, factually accurate while neatly sidestepping potential complications. "Just be aware that various agencies will interpret these events through their own institutional frameworks. Not everyone distinguishes clearly between methods and legitimacy." The warning was delivered professionally but unmistakably. Jack's military-grade defensive operation, while effective, existed in a gray area between civilian self-defense and quasi-military counter-cartel operations that some authorities might view with concern rather than approval. As official investigators gradually departed, the ranch community commenced rebuilding efforts. Neighbors arrived with materials and tools, repairing damaged structures and reinforcing defensive positions with the practical efficiency of people accustomed to self-reliance. The work proceeded without fanfare or dramatic declarations, simply the mutual support network that had sustained these isolated properties for generations. Maria Suarez coordinated many of these efforts, her natural leadership abilities emerging more prominently following the successful defense. Jack observed her directing repair teams with the same quiet competence she brought to ranch operations, establishing priorities and allocating resources with intuitive effectiveness. "The FBI agent seemed concerned about your methods," she noted during a brief break, handing Jack a water bottle as they surveyed the reconstruction of his damaged barn. "Worried you might be crossing some imaginary line between civilian and military domains." "It's a legitimate institutional concern," Jack acknowledged. "Government agencies prefer clear categorization, civilian self-defense in one box, military counter-cartel operations in another. What we implemented doesn't fit neatly in either container." Maria's expression hardened slightly. "While they worry about proper categorization, we worry about survival. Los Hierros doesn't respect jurisdictional boundaries or institutional frameworks. They control territory or they don't." The observation captured the essential disconnect between formal authority structures and ground-level realities in the contested borderlands. Official agencies operated through defined protocols and jurisdictional limitations, while the cartel pursued territorial objectives unconstrained by such considerations. By the fourth day after the engagement, media attention had discovered the story, transforming a tactical engagement into a narrative battleground fought through competing interpretations. Local news outlets portrayed the event as heroic resistance against cartel encroachment, civilian ranchers standing firm against criminal invasion. National coverage introduced more complex framing, questioning the militarization of civilian defense and the implications of private citizens implementing combat operations traditionally reserved for state security forces. Jack avoided media contact entirely, recognizing the strategic liability of public attention. Los Hierros operated most effectively in shadows, preferring territorial acquisition through intimidation rather than high-profile confrontation that might trigger sustained government response. The media spotlight created both protection through visibility and vulnerability through narrative distortion. On the fifth morning, Carlos Mendez arrived with information too sensitive for phone communication. "We've intercepted intelligence you should know," the Border Patrol agent said quietly as they walked the perimeter fence line, away from potential listening devices. El Arquitecto has temporarily suspended operations in this immediate sector, redirecting resources to less resistant corridors while maintaining surveillance here. The information aligned with Jack's tactical assessment. Los Hierros operated according to cost-benefit calculation rather than emotional response. When territorial acquisition became prohibitively expensive in one sector, they adjusted strategy rather than escalating indefinitely. "That's tactical withdrawal, not strategic abandonment," Jack noted. "They'll maintain pressure through alternative means while preparing adapted approaches." Carlos nodded. "Already happening. They've increased recruitment among local criminal networks, establishing deniable intermediaries for intelligence gathering and potential operations. Less direct than military-style assault, but potentially more insidious. The evolving threat profile required corresponding defensive adaptation. Direct assault had been repelled through prepared positions and coordinated response, but infiltration through local networks presented different challenges requiring different countermeasures. That afternoon, Jack called the first formal meeting of what would become the Border Ranch Security Network, an organized extension of the informal mutual aid system that had proven effective during the Los Hierros assault. 23 ranch owners gathered in Maria's rebuilt barn, representing properties spanning nearly 40 miles of borderland. "What we faced wasn't an isolated incident, but the leading edge of territorial expansion," Jack explained, standing before maps showing documented cartel activity throughout the region. Los Hierros is implementing systematic corridor development, targeting properties with strategic value for their transportation network. The assembled ranchers listened with the focused attention of people for whom abstract security concerns had become concrete threats. These weren't urban dwellers experiencing border issues through media reports but frontline civilians directly confronting cartel expansion into their communities. "The direct assault failed because we implemented coordinated defensive measures," Jack continued. "They'll adapt with different approaches, likely emphasizing infiltration, local recruitment, and targeted intimidation rather than overt military operations." Henry Weston raised a weathered hand. "So we need to adapt too. What's the practical strategy for maintaining what we've secured?" The question cut to the essential requirement: transforming tactical success into sustainable security. Repelling a single assault created temporary advantage but not permanent resolution. "Integrated security networks," Jack explained, outlining the defensive framework he developed based on counterinsurgency principles adapted for civilian implementation. "Coordinated observation, information sharing, graduated response protocols, and maintained defensive capabilities." For the next 2 hours, the group developed practical implementation plans, communication systems independent of vulnerable infrastructure, observation rotation schedules, intelligence sharing protocols, and resource allocation for collective security. The framework emphasized legal compliance while maximizing defensive effectiveness, creating a civilian adaptation of military security zone principles. As the meeting concluded, Maria addressed the assembled ranchers with quiet determination. What we're establishing isn't just mutual defense but community resilience. The cartel wants territory without resistance. We're demonstrating that this land carries prohibitive acquisition costs. The statement captured the strategic objective more precisely than formal security terminology, establishing territorial integrity through demonstrated capacity and commitment. Raising the cost of acquisition beyond Los Hierros' acceptable threshold. Not military victory in conventional terms, but successful deterrence through credible defensive capability. That evening, as Jack surveyed his repaired property from the ridge overlooking the main approach routes, he recognized the transformation that had occurred, not just in the physical security measures implemented throughout the ranch network, but in his own identity and purpose. For years following his retirement from the Marine Corps, he had maintained separation between his military experience and civilian existence, compartmentalizing his combat expertise as a closed chapter rather than integrated capability. The cartel incursion had collapsed that artificial boundary, bringing battlefield wisdom into direct application on his ancestral land. The recognition wasn't comfortable. Combat skills came with associated mental frameworks, threat assessment protocols, tactical prioritization, contingency planning for worst-case scenarios. The hypervigilance that kept Marines alive in combat zones created constant background tension when activated in civilian contexts. Jack had experienced this transition both ways, civilian to warrior when deploying overseas, warrior to civilian when returning home. Neither direction proceeded without psychological cost. Now, standing on his Texas ridge line conducting security assessment with the same methodical thoroughness he'd applied to Afghan outposts, Jack acknowledged that he had undergone another transformation, not fully returning to combat mentality, but integrating military expertise into civilian defense in ways that permanently altered his relationship with this land. The ranch was no longer simply ancestral property, but contested terrain requiring sustained security operations. The horizon no longer represented merely natural beauty, but contained potential approach routes requiring regular surveillance. The community was no longer just neighbors with shared lifestyle, but a defensive network with mutual security protocols. Jack's satellite phone rang, interrupting this reflection. Mike Reynolds' voice carried the distinctive tension of sensitive intelligence. Thought you should know, El Arquitecto has assigned a formal status to your territory in their communication channels. They're calling it Zona de Negation Denial Zone, officially recognized as non-permissive territory for standard operations. The designation represented significant tactical acknowledgement, formal recognition that the territory had effective defensive measures requiring specialized approaches rather than standard intimidation or assault tactics. In military terms, it constituted grudging professional respect for demonstrated capability. There's more, Reynolds continued. Vega has been reassigned from your sector. Apparently, El Arquitecto considers his direct confrontation approach inappropriate for the situation. They're bringing in someone with different specialization, intelligence operations and network infiltration rather than direct action. The information aligned with Jack's expected progression, Los Hierros adapting their approach based on tactical outcomes, shifting from direct confrontation to more sophisticated influence operations. The threat hadn't diminished but transformed, requiring corresponding defensive adaptation. 3 days later, Maria arrived at Jack's ranch with news from town, information flowing through the community network that provided insights beyond official intelligence channels. The bank manager mentioned unusual activity, she reported as they walked the eastern fence line, checking recently installed security measures. 3 local businesses approached about potential investment from Mexican development companies, significant capital for struggling operations. Jack recognized the pattern from counterinsurgency experience, economic infiltration establishing leverage points within communities, creating dependencies that gradually transformed into influence networks. Los Hierros adapting their approach from direct territorial seizure to progressive ecosystem manipulation. They're implementing social terrain mapping, he explained, drawing from military methodologies he'd studied during his final years in the Corps. Identifying community pressure points, establishing deniable influence operations, creating leverage through economic dependencies. Maria nodded, her expression reflecting practical understanding rather than abstract concern. So we expand our security framework beyond physical measures, community resilience protocols, economic independence initiatives, influence operation awareness. The observation demonstrated why Maria had naturally emerged as a key leader in the ranch security network, her ability to translate tactical insights into practical community applications, bridging military expertise and civilian implementation. That evening, as sunset painted the western sky in brilliant orange and deep purple, Jack sat on his rebuilt porch with a cup of coffee, mentally mapping the transformed security landscape. Los Hierros had shifted from direct territorial acquisition to sophisticated influence operations, still pursuing corridor control objectives but through adapted methodologies matching demonstrated defensive capabilities. The ranch network had correspondingly evolved from emergency mutual aid to structured security framework, observation protocols, intelligence sharing systems, graduated response capabilities, and community resilience measures. What had begun as crisis response had transformed into sustainable territorial integrity operations adapted for civilian implementation. Jack himself had undergone the most fundamental transformation, reintegrating military expertise into civilian context not as temporary emergency response but as enduring security framework. The mental partition between Marine Staff Sergeant Harmon and Texas Rancher Jack had dissolved, creating integrated capabilities shaped by both identities. The cost of this integration remained uncertain. Combat mindset carried psychological implications, hypervigilance, threat prioritization, contingency planning for worst-case scenarios. Maintaining appropriate activation levels within civilian context represented significant challenges, requiring conscious modulation to prevent operational exhaustion. Yet the alternative, vulnerability through artificial separation of capabilities from challenges, carried greater costs, particularly when facing adversaries like Los Hierros who recognized no distinction between civilian targets and military objectives. In contested environments, functional security required integrated capabilities regardless of formal categorization. As darkness settled over the ranch, Jack conducted a final security check with the disciplined thoroughness that had kept him alive through 5 combat deployments. The property had been transformed from generational homestead to defensible territory, observation posts established, response protocols implemented, communication systems secured. Not a military outpost, but a civilian property with integrated security frameworks appropriate to demonstrated threat profiles. The Border Ranch Security Network had expanded Jack's defensive perimeter beyond physical property to encompass community resilience, shared capabilities creating collective security that no individual ranch could maintain independently. The approach mirrored counterinsurgency principles he'd implemented overseas, adapted for civilian application in contested borderlands. Los Hierros remained present and determined, surveillance continuing, intelligence operations active, territorial objectives unchanged despite tactical setbacks. But the cartel now faced demonstrated defensive capability rather than anticipated vulnerability, forcing strategic reassessment rather than simple intimidation progression. The essential balance had shifted, not through decisive military victory, but through established credible deterrence, creating prohibitive acquisition costs for territory that remained under rightful ownership. Jack Harmon hadn't defeated El Arquitecto's organization, but had denied them assumed territorial control, transforming expected easy acquisition into sustained contested space. That transformation, from vulnerable civilian property to denied territory, represented the most significant outcome of recent events. Los Hierros would adapt and return with different methodologies, continuing pursuit of their corridor development objectives through alternative approaches. but they would do so recognizing demonstrated defensive capability rather than presumed vulnerability, adjusting risk calculations accordingly. As Jack completed his security circuit and returned to the ranch house, he acknowledged the personal transformation most significant to his individual journey: the reintegration of capabilities once compartmentalized, applying hard-won battlefield wisdom to protect home ground rather than distant outposts. The Marine who had defended forward operating bases in foreign mountains now secured ancestral lands against comparable threats, bringing specialized expertise full circle to its most meaningful application. 3 months after the confrontation at Jack's ranch, the borderland had reached a new equilibrium. The Border Ranch Security Network had expanded to include 37 properties spanning 60 miles of contested territory, implementing coordinated defensive measures that transformed isolated targets into integrated security zones. What Los Hierros had identified as vulnerable acquisition targets had become recognized denial territory requiring prohibitive resource commitment for penetration. Federal authorities had finally increased presence in the sector, motivated by media attention and political pressure following the high-profile cartel assault. Border Patrol patrols doubled, surveillance assets were reallocated to priority corridors, and interagency task forces established operational frameworks specifically addressing Los Hierros' expansion efforts. Most significantly, Mexican authorities had implemented targeted operations against El Arquitecto's organization following international pressure generated by the documented assault on American territory. Key logistics nodes had been disrupted, several lieutenants captured, and financial networks partially compromised. The cartel remained operational but significantly degraded in capacity, particularly regarding cross-border expansion capabilities. Jack observed these developments with professional assessment rather than emotional satisfaction. Los Hierros hadn't been destroyed. Organizations with their resources and territorial entrenchment couldn't be eliminated through single operations or temporary pressure. But their assumed freedom of action along this border sector had been decisively challenged, their operational calculations fundamentally altered by demonstrated resistance capacity. "They'll be back eventually," Carlos Mendez acknowledged during his periodic security briefing at the ranch. "Organizations like this adapt and return, but not with the same assumptions or expectations." Jack nodded, understanding the realistic security assessment. Different approach, adjusted tactics, revised threshold calculations. But facing prepared defense networks rather than isolated civilian targets. The distinction represented the most significant outcome, transforming expected vulnerable acquisition into recognized contested territory requiring specialized capabilities and prohibitive resource commitment. Not victory in conventional terms, but successful deterrence through credible defensive capability. The ranch itself had been fully rebuilt, damage repaired, and defensive measures refined based on lessons from the engagement. Jack had integrated security protocols into daily operations without surrendering the property's essential character as generational homestead rather than military outpost. Balance rather than replacement. Maintainable vigilance without operational exhaustion. Most evenings found Jack on his porch at sunset, monitoring the horizon with practiced vigilance while appreciating the land's enduring beauty. The transformation hadn't changed his connection to this territory, but deepened it through demonstrated commitment to its defense. The ranch was now secured not merely by legal ownership but by proven capability to maintain its integrity against determined threats. The cartel's defeat was undeniable, though some questioned the extent of Jack's actions. Most celebrated the powerful message sent: America does not bow to intimidation. Jack, humble yet firm, quietly stepped back from the limelight, continuing duties without fanfare, steadfast in moral clarity. His story stands as a testament to an enduring American truth, that genuine strength lies not in aggression but in preparedness, resolve, and the unwavering commitment to justice and liberty for all. What do you think about this incredible stand? Do you believe strength alone guarantees justice, or does real power lie in partnership, strategy, and bravery? Share your perspective in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping real-life stories of courage in the face of overwhelming odds.